I'm watching the numbers come in. They're starting to slow down. So I'm going to go ahead and formally kick us off. Good morning, everyone. I am Angie Caldwell. I am a principal with PYA. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our second annual Summer CPE Symposium, What is Hot in Healthcare and Hot Topics in Healthcare. So again, my pleasure to welcome you today. We have a few housekeeping items that we want to go over before we officially kick off the first session. As we are allowing CPE credit, continuing professional education credit for our certified public accountant attendees today, we have a few additional steps that we are taking so that we can comply with NASBA standards. First, we are tracking your attendance. We are tracking your attendance by your login and your log out time, and credit will be given only for those sessions that you attend in their entirety. Second, we're tracking your engagement throughout the session, and we do that by various polling questions that will appear throughout each of the sessions today. Today we have 2 sessions. Tomorrow we have 2 sessions, so we hope to see you again tomorrow. The first session today will have 5 polling questions. Typically the sessions will have 3, but our first session today has 5. It's a bit of a special session, which I'll introduce here in just a minute. But the polling question will come onto the screen, and you'll have about 30 seconds to answer the question before the responses to the poll are given. If you have any problems with answering the polling question at all, please go to the questions or to the chat function in your viewing pane and let us know what problem you're having, that you've missed the poll, that you're unable to answer, and that kind of thing. Also, understanding that we are all attending virtually, we understand that sometimes the internet might not be cooperating for you today. So if you do have trouble during the session and you are kicked off and you have to rejoin, if you would just send us a note in the chat box as well, we can ensure that we take that into account and ensure that you are still able to receive CPE credit. So also at the end of the session today, you will receive a survey related to that CPE credit. Please fill that out. We want to hear from you and know what you thought about the sessions today. So with that, all of the housekeeping taken care of, I am so happy to announce our first session. It is a wonderful panel discussion regarding the state of the healthcare industry. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague and friend, the managing principal of PYA Consulting, David McMillan. So with that, David, take it away.
Thank you, Angie. Welcome, everyone. I'd love to take this opportunity to express our appreciation at PYA for your participation today. But most of all, I really want to thank these panelists for taking all the time to prepare and share their perspectives with you today. This is a really robust group of panelists. I think you're going to find that their experience, their knowledge, their multiple perspectives are things that will be of great value as we navigate through some of the more significant challenges that are facing our industry today. So with that, it's my honor to introduce our panelists to you. I'm going to do just the briefest of introductions here before we get started, and then they will take the time to share a little bit more about themselves with you as we go through some of the polling questions. So Ann Hollenbeck is first. Ann's a partner at the law firm Jones Day. So Ann, thank you for being with us. Matt Vogelien serves as the Corporate Responsibility Officer at AdventHealth. Matt, we're so happy to have you, and we thank you for your participation. And Rich Rasmussen is the President and CEO of the Oklahoma Hospital Association. Rich, thanks so much for being with us. We look forward to hearing from you too. So what's going to happen, as Angie mentioned, this particular session is truly a panel session. We're going to ask you as participants some questions. We're going to give you just a moment to respond. And then our panelists are going to sort of unpack their own perspective on these questions and address some of what we are seeing in the trends on the answers based upon what your thoughts are. If you have questions that you would like to submit, as Angie mentioned before, please feel free to do so either in the questions or in the chat section. we'll be monitoring those, and we'd love to make sure that we have a chance to address your specific questions. We'll do our best, as you might imagine, to get to all of them if they were to come in. If we aren't able to get to them, we'll do our best to follow up after with response and perspective. So that's what we're going to do today. We look forward to this time with you. Now, when we go to the next polling question here in just a moment, and I'm going to put all of our panelists' pictures up on the screen in case your webinar may or may not be showing us in person. So those are the folks, and there is contact information for each of these panelists listed there if you'd like to reach out to them afterwards, perhaps, because again, I think you're going to find their expertise to be something that you'll want a little more of when this is all said and done. So when we go to our first polling question in just a minute, the screen will sort of change. You won't see us, but you'll hear us, and we're going to continue to talk as you respond to the poll. So just beware of that sort of issue. We'll be back with you. You won't have to be absent from us long after we ask each polling question. So let me go ahead and ask our moderator to take us to the first polling question. And while he does that, I'm going to ask Anne, if she would, to just share with us a little bit more about her background and her career. Anne, after I kind of read this first polling question for the participants, which end of public health emergency category of waiver or flexibility will be the most challenging to unwind? So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Please select your answer while Anne shares with us a little bit more about her background. Anne?
Sure, thank you, David, and it's a pleasure to be here with Matt and Rich. I am been a healthcare and life sciences lawyer for a few decades. It's been mostly focused on the provider side, so assisting health systems, hospitals, other types of providers in managing various things. Sort of bucket those in three things. Deal work, we're going to get into some of that today. Digital health matters, so whether that's telehealth, virtual care, also AI, which is something we're going to touch on today, as well as a heavy regulatory practice, keeping up with Medicare rules, HRSA rules, you name it, agency that comes out with regulations that impact providers. That's where we come in, and today we're going to hit on some of the price transparency pieces that we've been dealing with for a few years now. Thanks, David.
That's great. Well, thank you, Anne, and I know that introduction will help our audience maybe understand some of the context of your comments and responses here in just a moment. So, Mr. Moderator, if you feel like we have some good results, there we go. So let's just take a minute to absorb these. Expanded workforce, 29% of our participants. Arrangements with physicians and providers relying on Stark Law blanket waivers, 13. Discontinuing virtual, 9, which I want to unpack with you in just a moment, Anne. Expanded hospital capacity, 10. Changes to telehealth, again, Anne, maybe something you and the panelists will want to talk about. So if we were to put these in order, changes to telehealth are the majority of our participants felt like was the most challenging, with expanded workforce capacity coming in second, Stark Law blanket waivers third, hospital capacity fourth, and virtual direct supervision fifth. Great. All right. So while you absorb that for a minute, let's go back to the screen for a moment, Mr. Moderator. Thank you so much. And let's think for just a minute about these results together. Matt, maybe I'll start with you as someone who's working, day to day in the provider space. How do you react to what you saw on the screen?
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, sure. I'm not entirely surprised by that distribution, especially with telehealth being the top one. I think those flexibilities and some of the regulatory information that's come out around them, kind of creates some confusion and some critical thinking around, well, what is staying and what is going, right? That's an area where certain flexibilities will be staying, whether they're temporary or permanent, and some may be going away. So I'm not surprised that that is at the top of the list. As I think of one of the other, I don't think it was number 2. I think workforce was number 2. When I think of blanket waivers and the agreements with physicians during the PHE, I think that is likely one that many provider organizations are somewhat challenged by. I think there was so much, in the response to the patient surges and everything we were dealing with, there were a lot of different agreements that needed to be set up quickly with the physicians and relying on those waivers. I think our organization, I think, did a pretty good job of documenting all of those arrangements and setting, the appropriate, agreement term setting and things like that really helped us appropriately sunset that. We were able to make sure we had a solid inventory of that in our contract management system. But as I've talked to other compliance officers and other folks at providers, that's one that they're just trying to make sure that they have a handle on, sunsetting any of those agreements that might not still, where the waivers may not still apply, right? That's just a general challenge. And then again, just generally related to waivers, I think that's one of the overall pain points, right? With these categories that we have included in our polling question and the many more waivers, is what are, understanding our reliance on them, right? We were all adapting so fast at our organizations to gain an understanding of the waivers first, right? So regulatory, legal, compliance teams, executives were making these quick decisions, unlikely prioritizing as the main thing, documenting every single thing we were doing. So for large systems like our organization and others, it's just generally been challenging to ensure we understand where we were relying on waivers and where we weren't, right? So I know if it's helpful from a process perspective to share with others, we have, utilized various survey approaches and executive interviews and some targeted activities over the past 6 months. Really started early with a lot of the excellent resources from the government and from our other colleagues, including folks at firms like PYA, kind of putting together a checklist of things and really got ahead of it to make sure we were understanding our reliance on waivers and educating our people on the things that where we may not be able to rely on everything as the new normal, if that makes sense, right? So we have to understand, I think people have implemented some waivers and the flexibilities thinking that they may last forever, but that's not necessarily the case. So I don't know if that's helpful.
Absolutely. And I would like to ask you one follow-up before I go to Ann and Rich on this. Again, given your position and your sphere of influence within your own organization, how do you think this is going to change your workflow going forward from a compliance standpoint? We tend to say people don't adapt quickly, but in reality, with 200 or so waivers, we adapted pretty quickly to some of the flexibility provided by those waivers, and sometimes, pulling that back in might be difficult. So, as you think about this through the lens of compliance, how do you view, your immediate and intermediate future within your own organization, working hard to make sure that, hey, I know we did it this way for a couple of years, but we've got to make an adjustment.
Yeah, that's a great question, David. I think it fits importantly into our risk assessment and activities and things. I think that's risen to the top of, as the PHE has come to the end, there's a lot of things that many organizations likely have on their enterprise risk list or the risk management list. That would be a key priority, is really making sure from a compliance and legal teams, and we have a regulatory team, we all heavily collaborate. We're all just trying to be on the ground and have conversations with all of our folks to assess any risks we might have if we think we're continuing something that has quote unquote gone away. And so it certainly impacted our workflow and some of our time constraints and our time commitment to, one of the other things, for example, on the list would be, the physician supervision changes, right? That's a condition of payment with the government. And so people have gotten so used to, so we're doing some of the same work, in compliance and assessing things like that. But with the waiver wind down, it's giving us an opportunity to go out and make sure that we're still following all those rules, and everybody understands that not everything that became easier during this is going to be something we can continue legally from a regulatory. That's just another good example that's on our list here is physician. I mean, if you're not providing the appropriate level of physician supervision, and the requirement was immediate supervision, but for a period of time we were able to do that virtually. If we don't revert back to the requirement, that there's some trouble. So I think it's definitely impacting just some of the things that we need to focus on over I would say the next 12 months at a minimum to make sure we have a good handle on it.
Sure. And would you sort of take it from there, from your perspective? What are you hearing from your clients in terms of challenges similar to those that Matt was sharing with us?
Yeah, sure, David. Just to piggyback on that, a couple of clients have really struggled with for physician supervision of residents. During the pandemic, the primary care exception, which many hospitals rely on, was expanded, and it's pulled back, and that has caught a couple of our clients unaware. And then the flip side is another client thought that pullback occurred 18 months ago. So it's a frustrating experience, right? To try to unwind some of these things and to keep up with a variety of different topic areas. The prescribing pursuant to a telehealth visit has been an enormous frustration, enormous source of frustration for all hospitals that we're working with. As we know, DEA languished for years prior to the pandemic, putting out the guidance they were expected to give, that Congress directed them to give. Then the pandemic came. We had a marvelous shift in that, and then some proposed rules in February. Then shortly before they were to be made final, they were extended. So for now, we're back in a holding pattern. But I really empathize with anybody running a digital health network right now. It's really challenging.
Yeah, for sure. And Rich, to that point, having represented and being an advocate for providers in multiple states now throughout your career, but every one of those states having both, urban, suburban, and rural facilities, do you see these challenges differing among the geographies and the specific circumstances of some of your association members? What are some of your thoughts as you've listened to your colleagues?
Well, and I think, yes, I mean, certainly there were advantages that were created into the waiver framework for our most fragile providers, our critical access hospitals as an example. But I think the bigger question we should be asking ourselves is what materially changed when we waived these regulations? And I think that's something I think as a provider community, we should be doing that inventory, sharing it to your state hospital association, sharing it with our partners, the American Hospital Association, because if we didn't negatively impact patient care, patient safety, but we were able to identify bottlenecks. This is the perfect lean study, the perfect capstone study for someone to say, why do we have to reinstate these regulations? And I think that's something that I haven't really seen to date, a very large compendium of here's where we could continue the relaxation of these regulations. And I think that's a big question we need to be asking ourselves, because now what we're doing is now we're going to add cost again back to the system at a time when we don't need cost added back to the system. So my encouragement for folks would be, within your organizations, take some time to examine this and then filter it back up to your advocacy partners. Because I think when we have those conversations with Congress, we should be talking about this. And I think we'll step back. One other piece is looking at what's going on in your state level. So when we created pathways to expedite licensure, for example, for nurses, physicians, others, what was done at the same time in these intervening sessions in our legislatures to keep that in place? And so there are places where we find their state law might be able to step in and create some a pathway for us that would not run a conflict with the state law, but would allow us to have some more comfort in how we operate. I think we should be looking for that as well. So that's just kind of a state, advocacy perspective or spin on it. I think that's something we should be doing. I hate to put regulation back on us again, and that's essentially what we're doing. And we're gonna add more compliance review. We're gonna spend more on consultants. And what are we fixing? What's broken? So just something to think about.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. One thing I'd like to make sure that building on that just a little bit, you made reference to relaxing some regulations around some workforce and things, and we didn't necessarily in our responses touch specifically on expanding that workforce capacity. And while this may not be a PHE waiver specific issue, it certainly, we all know that the PHE exacerbated what we knew was coming already in the healthcare workforce. And Matt, turning to you first, I mean, providers, especially acute care providers who employ lots of trained healthcare individuals. We've all read the articles about the various challenges facing providers from a workforce perspective. Can you give us any insight from your perspective about things that you see happening that are promising, things that our participants may want to know about, great ideas that you're pursuing as you think about the future of your workforce?
Yeah, I can try, David. As the compliance officer, I'm not super I'm not as much of an expert on the operations and human resource side of things, but I certainly am aware that, of the challenges that we've encountered over the past several years. I know this won't be a specific answer, but the organization is, our organization has implemented some very specific and intentional things for workforce retention and workforce growth. And, we're really trying to keep our clinicians in particular and make sure that they're taken care of and that they want to stay at the organization, that they're a part of. So I think it's been, I think our organization has responded pretty well, the best we can to some of that. Again, I don't directly work in that space in my role, but I'm sure what others might have to share.
Yeah, well, I'll turn it over to Rich and Ann to make a closing comment here in just a moment. But what I think I would offer for our participants today is that we here at the firm are receiving a number of requests to assist with various affiliations, and given her history and sort of transactions, it's that art of the JOA. It's a term of art, not necessarily a technical term, but that joint operating agreement working between providers and various educational institutions to think about longer term types of workforce development activities together. And we've seen examples of a lot of those prior to the pandemic, certainly, but post-pandemic, I think that is something that everyone is having to take a much more longitudinal sort of approach to. So, Ann, Rich, either of you have some thoughts to close us out on this first polling question related to workforce development?
I'll add that it is, I think, the strongest headwind that we're going to continue to experience. We look at the retirements just in our nursing team members alone. It's a challenge for all of us. And back to evaluating what we learned during the pandemic, for those states that are not nurse magnet states or nurse compact states, you ought to be looking at it. I mean, my experience of those states where licensure could be expedited because of compacts, whether it's in nursing or in other fields, you should be looking at that, because this isn't going to be the first experience that we're going to have with the pandemic. But what we can do to make it much easier to license and expedite that licensure is going to be critical, and that's not going to change going forward. So, and particularly as we move into more systemization, being able to have compacts that support our healthcare organizations across multiple states, I think, again, that's going to be very important as well. And that's a state decision.
Yeah, appreciate that, Rich. Ann, any closing thoughts here?
I think that covers it very well.
Perfect. Yeah, I really appreciate. So thanks to our panelists, and hopefully that's a taste of what you have in store for the next 4 polling questions, and you're excited to move ahead. So with that said, I want to ask our moderator, if you would, to take us to the next polling question. And while he does that, Matt, why don't you share just a little bit more with our participants about your experience as they consider whether pricing transparency is a boom or a bust?
Sure, happy to do that, David. Yeah, I've been with AdventHealth for about a little over 5 years now. We're in 9 states, have about 50 hospital campuses, and hundreds of other care sites, about 80,000 team members nationally. And I serve as the corporate responsibility officer here in our Central Florida division. And with the help of a wonderful compliance team, I cover about 20 of our hospitals and a couple of our large medical groups in my role. And prior to that, I was in the corporate compliance department at Carolina's healthcare system, which is now Atrium Health in North Carolina. And then before that, spent about 15 years with a couple different consulting firms, specifically Arthur Andersen, Huron, and Navigant. And in that period of time, I pretty much exclusively focused on compliance programs, effectiveness assessments, investigations, litigation support, things like that in those years of consulting. But I've always been spent my entire career in the healthcare compliance space.
Oh, that's quite a rich career. No pun intended with a panelist named Rich on the screen here. So let's go ahead and get to our results, Mr. Moderator, so that we can start unpacking this one too. It seems like most folks think that we either don't have enough data or it's just not working to this point. So with that as sort of some context for us to begin, let's go back to our screen here. So let me ask each of our panelists, as I sort of maybe take us through just a teeny bit of context. Here we are trying to empower the consumer. I mean, when it comes right down to it, we're trying to empower the consumer to understand how to better consume their healthcare. We kind of go back to World War II and after World War II and sort of the competition to try to get folks employed. We saw the rise of healthcare benefits becoming part of an employment incentive, if you will, and trying to get a workforce put in place, especially during the war. And so that became expected, right? I mean, it's easy to give things, hard to take them away. But we all know that the consumer became a little anesthetized to how healthcare costs really worked because it all sort of ran through their plan. And here we are now, many of us, myself included, on high deductible plans where we're once again kind of sitting a little bit more in that driver's seat as a consumer, and we say, gosh, where do we turn for this kind of information? So along comes the sort of data and pricing transparency and this, that, and the other. And so, Rich, when you see those results about, hey, there's not enough data yet, or it's just not working in terms of the requirement for acute care centers to post their shoppable services and things of that nature, there are a number of things that fall into that pricing transparency bucket. What are you hearing from like I said, your constituents and others?
That's a great question, David. And I also think there are some things for us to think about as well. I'll put one thing out there because I asked this question the other day at the Oklahoma Hospital Council, and that is, whatever happened with HFMA's work to eliminate the charge master? Remember that? Whatever happened to that work? I'd love to know, because everything seems to fall back into that bucket when we talk about this, and it's difficult for us to explain away. And so the work on transparency, I think from the hospital's perspective, we're exhausted with this because we recognize that's not what we're being paid. And so the information that's probably most important isn't really readily available. Certainly what we get paid, so the public can see that's true transparency. Here may be what we're charging, but here's what we're getting paid, or here's what the government will pay us, and it's just clearly a demonstration of the inadequacy in their payments. So we have that that's hanging out there. But I also think too, the information that really empowers the consumer isn't available to them, or the information that's most important to them, such as what is their patient responsibility. And that creates the tension in the healthcare organization. We have to sit across the table, patient financial services are helping them figure out how we're going to bill for it. what are the tools that we can put in place to help the patient for that? And that should be something globally available. They shouldn't have to come into AdventHealth or the flagship downtown hospital and go through this. They ought to be able to look and clearly see on their own health plan's website what their patient responsibilities are going to be. So I think that's a challenge. And I think also for providers is, particularly smaller providers, how do we equip ourselves when we go into some of these, into the pricing transparency responsibilities that we have to be compliant, but also just in when we contract with plans. And I know, David, you guys have some really incredible tools, that we've been promoting. And when I was in Montana, we promoted those tools as well, and we'll be doing it here in Oklahoma. So I think as providers utilize the tools that are available out there so that they can be smarter in terms of how they work with their patients, smarter in how they work with the payers, and then certainly smarter in how they comply with federal requirements. I think that's our 3 focus areas, and those are some of the things I think are missing. So HFMA update, I'd love to know where we are on eliminating the charge master. That would be great.
Maybe someone will respond in our chat or question area about that. And listening to those thoughts from Rich and listening to your clients, what are some of your perspectives on the effectiveness or lack thereof as it relates to the transparency that we're trying to get into the hands of the consumer?
Sure, David. In preparation for today, I pulled some statistics on the enforcement activity of CMS on this one. Just as a refresher, hospitals were subject to these regulations beginning in January of 2021. As of January of 2023, so with 2 years in, CMS had issued 500 warning notices to hospitals saying they weren't in compliance, 230 requests for corrective action plans, but hospitals receiving penalties in the year 2022 only numbered 2. So I think that tells us that as providers, we jumped into action like we always do, and got on board with that. I might poke a little bit at the payer question. It was not until January of 2022, a year later, that the payers were subjected to a similar price transparency rule. Of course, it was much more narrow and related to balance billing of ER services, ambulance services, and certain out-of-network providers at an in-network facility. But, I tend to agree with the audience. We just haven't had enough time yet to see how this type of thing empowers a consumer.
Can I add something,
David? Go ahead, Rich.
Real quick.
Yeah.
And that is, even though we're seeing 500 warnings, 230 corrective actions, 2 penalties, the forces that want to damage our reputation, our community trust, are going to focus in on those 500 warnings. And so we as organizations, here we're having a conversation with compliance officers, folks in the finance space. We also need to be bringing along those that are responsible for the messaging in our organizations, because we are already seeing it. There are numbers of organizations out there that are trying to do reputational harm to hospitals and health systems, based on what is perceived to be huge, widespread noncompliance. And so we just need to be thinking about that and making sure in our own organizations we're bringing those minds together so that we have a strong forward message. When we find ourselves, and some of us will find ourselves under attack because might be perceived as gross noncompliance. So just something to think about. And we might be tagged for the whole industry, not just our own organization.
Yeah, and I'll tack onto that for just a minute, Matt, as you give consideration to your comments about saying this. It's all perspective driven as well. There have been all sorts of surveys done on compliance, and what's interesting is the advocacy groups that are working on behalf of the consumer and the patients almost without fail report a larger percentage of non-compliance than those organizations that are surveying compliance who are either somewhat, agnostic in terms of their approach, or are more provider focused, who will generally report greater compliance. So it can be one of those things where, to Ann's point about the warnings and about this, that, and the other, yes, the regulations state, okay, here's what an acute care facility has to be posting. But it's, can I get to that information? Is it understandable? How many clicks through the website do I have to go through to get there? And at some point, it becomes a subjective exercise as to whether or not compliance is there. So to Rich's point, communication, I think, becomes a really important component of certainly everything, but on this particular matter, because it is certainly garnering some press. I think it lumps into that same category of sometimes the community benefits that are offered by some of our nonprofit providers. While, yes, we've got a Schedule H and we put up these really slick community reports, Rich, you know this, oftentimes the Schedule H is where the opponents in particular are going to quantify community support. And all of us that work with nonprofit acute care hospitals know that there's a lot of community support that finds its way into other parts of the system that never gets reported on that Schedule H. So sometimes we are compliant in sort of maintaining the best kept secrets about ourselves in that messaging process. And I think transparency, to Rich's point, is one of those areas where a really strong communication plan needs to be in place, and with targeted advocacy groups and targeted constituents, because how you're going to communicate to your legislator, that messaging may be a little bit different than how you're communicating among your current population. So Matt, with kind of all that as some fodder, any thoughts from you as one on the front lines actually trying to, as an organization, be compliant with these sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think you all have covered it, really well. It's been a noble effort, but we're not quite, there's consensus. We're not there where it's meeting the objective, which is to provide, the consumer with what they need for shoppable services, to understand their patient responsibility, as Rich said. So I think we're in this state where, most providers, recognizing there have been some of those warnings that were mentioning, most providers have figured out how to quote unquote comply, right, with good intention. You've got machine readable file compliance, but it's still, there are a lot of studies out there about the compliance and the non-compliance, but I similarly was just playing around doing a little research myself, and there's some other interesting reports. There was one from the Kaiser Foundation around the actual usefulness of the data and the things that we've talked about this morning. So that was an interesting resource, kind of talked about where we are today and where we can go in the future. But I similarly, I think Rich nailed it on the head when he brought up the communication thing. I think a lot of providers are complying. The database or the file itself is not giving the consumer what they need, but we are one of those organizations that is implementing other tools to help our patients get to what they need to know to seek out services they need and to understand, what their costs may be. So that is certainly, and that is our messaging from our finance and revenue cycle teams and in the community, that we're trying to get there for our patients, not just going to this link on this database and trying to look through a charge master.
Right.
So
yeah, for sure. And I'll ask the moderator if they're able to do this, to post a link within the chat to the tool that Rich referenced that PYA has put together, the pricing transparency tool. If I do say so myself, it's a powerful tool. It makes things a lot easier in this particular arena in terms of getting to the point Matt was making, some usable information as opposed to just a lot of data. Anybody can sort of regurgitate data. Can you distill that down into some usable information? So if they could maybe post that link, that might be helpful to some of the participants. Okay, well, we got to keep moving here. We've got a couple more questions. And Ann, I'm going to prep you for this next one. If our moderator might take us to the next polling question. Ann, we're going to start with you when we get to the back side of this, because we're talking about artificial intelligence, and you mentioned that in your intro. But while our participants consider whether this overhaul is fact or fiction. Rich, can you tell us just a little bit more about your career and yourself?
I appreciate it, David. Yeah, I've spent virtually my entire career in healthcare advocacy. Right out of school, spent a little bit of time on Capitol Hill, and then really cut my teeth in healthcare while working at AdventHealth before going to the Florida Hospital Association, where I spent 28 years working with some of the smartest folks that I've ever been around, and learned a lot in that process and wore many hats. And then almost 6 years ago, I had the opportunity to leave Florida and move to beautiful Big Sky State, Montana, where I served as the CEO of the Montana Hospital Association. And it was a very different marketplace for healthcare, because we had 50 critical access hospitals. We look at those hospitals, we had some with net patient revenues of less than $3 million, but they were serving their community. In fact, when we looked at all of those critical access hospitals, we found out that more than half of them generated less net patient revenues than the average Home Depot generated in revenues. And the revenue target for Home Depot is $50 million annually out of each store. And so very different environment to work in. Thoroughly enjoyed it. And then now I'm in Oklahoma, where for my wife, who was born in Norman, Oklahoma, it's kind of like returning back to where she started. So we're delighted to be here, a very different marketplace. And in in Oklahoma, the public supported Medicaid expansion and put it into their constitution. And now we are evolving into a Medicaid managed care environment where providers will be paid the average commercial rate, and our supplemental payments will be used to help fund that ACR. And so it becomes even more important that we have data, and that we use that data to help us price appropriately, ensure that we keep the health plans accountable. And so I think that's, for the next couple of years, is really what we're going to be focusing in on. And then that we just talked about just moments ago, telling the story of what we do in healthcare. And we don't do a very good job of telling it as a state. We do a great job talking about our service lines. And so we're going to focus in on telling that story here in the state.
Thanks, Rich. That's great to hear, and I really appreciate your perspective from that advocacy role. It's important for us to understand that those things don't just happen. People work hard at that, and we're so glad to have you on this panel with us. So I'm going to ask our moderator to sort of give us the results of this one. And we say basically 2/3 of our audience believe that artificial intelligence will, in fact, play a role in overhauling healthcare. So let's jump back to our panelists here on the screen. And Anne, I warned you, we're going to start with you on this one. Give us some of your thoughts.
Sure, I'm delighted. AI has gotten so much attention since November with the chat features. But it's been around in healthcare for some time. What's new, I think, is the fact that we've had our first set of proposed rules out of the federal government. They came in April of this year. This is a proposed rule focusing on how predictive decision support interventions will be used. So really a focus on how AI will be regulated when it is used in clinical care and in that decision making, right? And this notion of taking the place of a physician or interrupting the physician-patient relationship. I will throw out there, the World Health Organization has a robust white paper on the subject. And in it, they make two, I think, interesting findings. One is that the diagnostic and decision-making on a remedy for an illness is more accurate when done by AI. And the second finding was that AI is a more empathetic tool than a physician. I personally found that shocking and maybe a little bit, I was a little bit offended on behalf of my my physician friends and clients. But really the point is that there's some fear that goes along with it, right? So we need some regulations that will protect patient safety and health and security, that'll protect privacy, and that will protect the intellectual property rights that many of our organizations have with respect to the data that is then used to educate the machine, that creates the machine learning. We've got some states out in front. We have laws enacted in Vermont, Colorado, Illinois, and Washington on AI. So, I mean, the struggle will be a patchwork of different rules, but AI has the possibility, of course, to automate certain, I think, diagnostic tools in a way that will most definitely outperform a human who might be studying things over and over throughout a workday. But we've got a long way to go with respect to managing the use of AI.
Rich, Matt, this one's wide open.
Well, Matt, I'll jump on something. I asked Chat OpenAI this question. And if you haven't signed up for these AI tools, they're actually pretty cool. So I said, will artificial intelligence overhaul healthcare? And what the chat said to me was artificial intelligence has the potential to significantly impact and transform healthcare in a variety of ways. And this is what was gleaned from billions of records. Medical imaging, we could see that. We just saw some recent data on that in terms of examining breast MRIs. Diagnostics and decision making, clearly we believe that. I mean, the billions of medical records that can be gleaned momentarily and help with diagnosis. Personalized medicine, how it can help analyze genomic data. We've seen that for some time, particularly in our NCI designated centers. Drug discovery and development, we're going to see more of that based on the technologies we deployed in our COVID vaccine development. Virtual assistants and chatbots, many of us have that. But then it gets down to, I think, here where there's a great conversation on those administrative efficiencies. Certainly we can see that on the back office and rev cycle.
Right.
And I think if you're a white collar, if you're a parent and your child is thinking about becoming an attorney, I might rethink that one. Because what do attorneys do? They review the law. Well, an AI bot can review the law and give a single attorney the work that many young attorneys could do. But it's interesting as you go and you read down what Chat has to say. In the very end, I think this is kind of gets a little bit to Ann's point. It says, however, it's important to note that AI in healthcare also poses challenges and concerns, including data privacy, ethical considerations, regulatory frameworks, and the need for human oversight. So I think in our field, in the direct patient care delivery, I believe there's always going to be a person there. It's the support mechanisms that help our organizations and certainly our pension for leaning in on more efficiency. I think that's where AI has the potential, but it can also be a disruptor within our own workforce. And I think that kind of, Matt, being a leader at AdventHealth, that I'd be curious what your thoughts are, because I think that's where the disruption is going to be.
Yeah, I completely agree, Rich. I did the same thing yesterday and had the same list. It was really cool. I think this, and we could I no doubt do a webinar entirely on this interesting topic, right? I was thinking yesterday, but to all these points, if we were to go out like Jimmy Fallon or a late night show host and do the sidewalk questioning thing, right? If you ask somebody what AI stood for, what would they say? Artificial intelligence, right? But I saw, as we have this conversation, I've seen a lot of references to it being augmented, to augmented intelligence, right? It's utilizing, especially around clinical decision making and supporting clinicians. That is sort of where the risks are. And so folks are saying that's where there's value in helping the clinicians and augmenting their decisions. But I think you're right. Saw another interesting reference to the opportunity here to reduce physician pajama time, right? Like all the hours spent in the, doing some of the administrative aspects, right? Recognizing that, AI shouldn't be the comprehensive, reliable clinical documentation, right? That's going to cause other audit and compliance things that we have to consider. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of, but there's a lot of other efficiencies that can be achieved. In fact, we are one of the healthcare systems that has one of these cool GE command centers, right? And so we've been using this some form of AI to help with patient throughput for several years now, right? For multiple campuses, we have a command center that helps us, with all of our patient transport. So definitely has many potential uses. And to your points, right? Everybody's recognizing we've got to have some oversight. We've got to have some appropriate regulation, and it's mostly around how do we protect the IP and patient privacy and the security of this information that's going out there. So again, fascinating topic. I know we could go for hours, but I think everybody.
One last thing I'll think about again is as I look back at the internet, what if we had put up roadblocks at state borders? And I think that's our real risk, because this technology could be life-changing in terms of the delivery that we do as healthcare organizations. But if we have state roadblocks put up every way, large systems, let's use Advent, you're a large system, a Common Spirit, whoever it happens to be, you could really disrupt care in some states based on, reactionary legislation, state legislation. So for us to be involved, I think we need to make sure that our voices are heard at the state and federal levels, that we don't create something that could really disrupt marvelous, life-changing care that could be delivered in our organizations.
Absolutely.
Well, one thing, as many of you may know, PYA has a IT security consultancy here, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that my IT security colleagues would say AI is going to be part of the solution to helping make records more secure, while it's also part of the problem that bad actors will be utilizing that same AI to find new and inventive ways to pierce those privacy veils and to hold us hostage. And so it is maybe the closest thing to the wild west that we've had in healthcare, perhaps, or in the world in a long time. And all I can do as a child of the 80s is think about war games and all of those things that we were told were going to happen, right? So
don't forget the Terminator.
The Terminator, that's right. So buckle up. Okay, let's get to our next polling question here, and we will try to move through the actual poll itself a little more quickly if our moderator will pull that up. So kind of making a left-hand turn here, AI, the promise of tomorrow, what's going on, health system consolidation, sort of the continuing saga, right, of health system consolidation. And we have a lot of history and a lot of perspective on this one. Does it decrease costs? Does it provide us improved access to care? Does it prevent rural hospitals closures? Does it do all of that? Does it do all of that except actually decrease costs? And again, here's a question that I think is in large part dependent upon your perspective. Patient advocacy groups sometimes have one perspective on this. Providers and maybe even regulators and legislators have other perspectives on it. But the reality is we have a payer system that is very, very consolidated and is consolidating the provider system as we speak. We have a provider system that remains remarkably fragmented despite the consolidation. And so when we look at the ecosystem of healthcare, there are a lot of sort of different situated components of that ecosystem and of that economy. So let's go ahead and move on to the responses if we can and see where we're at. So interesting, 43% of our respondents say, yep, it's going to do all those things except actually decrease costs. 32% say it's going to do all of that, and then smattering among just the sort of the singular responses, for the rest of them. So let's go ahead and move back to our panelists. And let me say, as someone who's been sort of involved in transactions for the entirety of my career, I've been on the forefront of this one, and I know that this is one that has been a big part of your practice as well. What I would have to say in my own experience is that, yes, we can consistently demonstrate, I think, where we were more efficient as a result of a transaction in certain areas. What sometimes gets lost is just the increasing regulatory cost of healthcare in general. So you can kind of go back to a baseline that you're measuring against with respect to some efficiencies. But what's happening is, with all of the things we've talked about here today, there are costs layered onto organizations that would have been there with or without the actual consolidation, and layering those costs on can create some opaqueness when trying to look back and say, are we or aren't we more efficient than we were in the past? Now, of course, cost is also one of those things that is dependent upon your perspective. Cost to a patient is one thing, cost to the actual provider is something else, right? For the provider, the patient's perspective on cost is revenue. And so this is one of those position dependent sort of things when we think about cost. But Ann, just real quickly here, as we work towards the end of our time together, your thoughts on what your clients and you're seeing in the industry as this consolidation trend really has no end in sight.
Happy to, and want to say the answer to the poll to me was all of the above. Just on June 8th, the American Hospital Association provided testimony before the U.S. Senate Finance Committee and gave data on each of those factors, explaining, yes, this is essential to rural hospitals. There is quality improvement. There are more services that are then provided in different markets post-consolidation. And then not to ever be minimized is helping with those insurance negotiations. In that testimony, the AHA gave the following statistic, that in more than half of all markets in the United States, there is a single health insurer that controls at least 50% of the commercial market. So that right there makes it seem like it's really essential for this to continue. But what we're up against is the federal government, the Department of Justice, the FTC. The Department of Justice has lost the last 3 out of 4 of its merger challenges in federal court, but they're undeterred. The American Bar Association had its spring meeting in March in DC, and the DOJ in that meeting said, hey, we may have lost, but we believe that our aggressive strategies have a deterrent effect. Similarly, the FTC recently lost 2 of its recent administrative complaints, which means these are complaints before their own judges, before an administrative law judge. But the scrutiny, particularly in healthcare, is something we are just going to continue to see. What does it mean? I think it's that we plan carefully. When we're going to proceed with the consolidation, we get organized from the very beginning, meaning antitrust is step 1, having in place all of the safeguards to ensure during the negotiations we aren't sharing prices and engaging in federal criminal price fixing, as well as to begin planning early for those essential services to be provided at rural health systems, to ensure the quality improvement, to ensure there's more care, so that we're building that case at the very outset to have that successful consolidation and to withstand what we know will be questions from federal and in some cases state authorities. The private equity acquisitions in healthcare those are just extra risky from a FTC DOJ perspective. They do not like those in the healthcare space for obvious reasons, right? They're usually heavily leveraged, which means there's a focus on those owners for short-term gains. And of course, what works better is to have a long-term plan for ensuring the delivery of quality healthcare to residents of the state, of the markets, et cetera.
I know this is an entire sort of webinar or day on this particular topic, and we're up against some of our time here. So I'd ask maybe Matt if you could think about your perspective on not only this particular topic, what you heard, and give you the impossible task of giving that in maybe a minute or so.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Ann made great points there. I had some of the same notes and thoughts. Right? The scrutiny is around the big bad health systems potentially. Although we're trying to serve the communities, we're getting larger, and there's this perception that it's about the revenue and all that. I think if we remain focused on the consumer access and consumer focus and the cost efficiency and the messaging around that, and like you said, Ann, how are we actually delivering better quality services and better patient access in the community, we can hopefully make some strides. But there's certainly the scrutiny. And I thought your comment around private equity was interesting. That's on my mind. You've got all these private equity investors out there, and they want to partner with our systems as joint ventures. And there's False Claims Act scrutiny of some of those private equity transactions. So I would just say to folks, from putting my compliance officer hat on, ensure due diligence around those corporate, not trying to dig on anybody, but ensure the right due diligence. And some of those investors may not have robust compliance programs. So as you are going through transactions involving them, that's just something to think about, and something I thought I would mention as a compliance officer. But no, I think Ann covered it, very well as far as what's going on in this space.
Fantastic, thanks. Rich, thoughts here as we close out our session with our participants?
Yeah, the only thing I would say, I kind of liken big insurance as big tobacco. And so I think the pressures we're seeing are just the beginning, particularly when we get closer to the question of the solvency of the Medicare Trust Fund. But I think as it relates to whether we're developing a joint operating agreement, we have a true governing board or advisory board to our healthcare organizations, making sure that you have a level of community engagement and community participation in those boards. Because as we get bigger, people feel we're getting further away. And so making sure that we create those opportunities to have engagement at the local level, working its way up to the highest level, I think is going to be important. That's a place where we can play, where the out-of-state health plans can't play. So as we work into this, I just challenge all of our healthcare organizations to keep that in mind. How do we keep some engagement at that local level as we grow up?
That's a great point. It's maybe a worn out cliche, but all healthcare is local at some point or another when you get to that actual patient encounter. So thanks to our panelists. This has been a fantastic session. We had one more polling question. I just sort of made the executive decision. We're having a great discussion. We're not going to push the time and get to it. We're going to allow our panelists to really unpack these four that they had an opportunity to weigh into, and that you as participants had an opportunity to give your opinion on. I hope you found this valuable. I certainly did. Matt and Rich, thank you so much, not only for participating, but for what you're doing for our industry every day. You're making a difference, and we are so pleased that you chose to spend this hour with us. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Angie,
Thank you,
I believe it goes back to you. Thanks,
It
guys.
sure does. It sure does. Thank you, everyone. So for our participants that are staying on for the second session of the day, just please stay on, stay connected. You have a 10-minute break. The next session starts at 11:15. For those that are closing out after our first session today, we will miss you. There will be an attendee survey that you will receive once you close out of your attendance of our webinar today. Thank you so much, and we'll see you back at 11:15.